Welcome, everyone. My name is Libby, and I want to thank you for joining tonight's webinar. Joining me tonight as my guest speaker and my co-host is Lifetime's Director Heather Featherston, who also has extensive background and understanding in accounting, and she's going to present to us as much as we can know about the adoption tax credit. So one of the reasons we love this topic is because it applies to questions people have at all stages of adopting. And so whether you're just now starting to think about adopting a child, or if maybe you're already actively waiting, or maybe you're just getting the funds together and trying to plan because you know this is around the corner and you're going to take the step and start, but all the way to, I know that there are people joining us right now who have recently welcomed their child home or maybe recently finalized their adoption. So this is a really important topic to keep track of because number one, now I just want to give a little disclaimer that as all of us know, sometimes tax information and tax laws can change quickly. So it is always wise to consult your own tax expert and tax professional when it comes down to applying this to your specific adoption. But it is good to know about this resource because this has been something that has helped a lot of people reach their adoption goals when they know that they're going to be able to apply this later. So with that, we want to encourage your questions and comments. We will try and answer as many of them as we can. And if we don't know the answer, we may know where to point you so that you can get that answer. But we just want to thank all of you for being here. And Heather, thank you especially for joining us tonight and helping us to better understand the adoption tax credit.
Absolutely. And I would really, Libby, echo what you said about talking to your tax professional, whoever does your taxes. If you do your own taxes, then we'll get you some resources so you can learn more about that on your own too. But there are some different limitations. There's some different, just some different little idiosyncrasies we're going to talk about tonight. And but always, like I say, I'm not preparing your taxes, so definitely you want to talk to who is preparing your taxes, who knows your financial position, because a lot of this sometimes may be dependent on income and different things like that. So we're going to jump right in here and begin talking about the adoption tax credit. So the adoption tax credit was started probably around 10 years ago or so. And it really was started as a way to help families make adoption more affordable. It enabled them to take some of the expenses as a credit to their taxes. And we're going to cover it a little more, but just right now, briefly, a credit to your taxes is different than a deduction from your taxes. When you do your taxes, what you do is you're able to deduct certain things from your income, things like your home mortgage interest. That's the big one where people do their itemized deductions. They add up how much they paid for, say, mortgage interest, maybe your property tax, different other taxes you may have paid, and then you subtract that from your income to get your the amount that you pay taxes on. So that's how your deductions work. How a credit works, a tax credit, is after you've done all that with subtracting your mortgage, and then you figure out how much tax you owe. Say you owe the government $20,000 in taxes. That's when you subtract your tax credit. So if you had a $10,000 tax credit, instead of owing the government $20,000 in taxes, you owe them $10,000 in taxes because you were able to subtract that credit. So it really is a dollar for dollar reduction in the tax you owe, whereas your mortgage interest, certainly that helps you, but it doesn't, those deductions are never as valuable as a tax credit. So like I say, that we kind of jumped right into advanced, but if you followed me there, I think maybe you have a good understanding of that. If not, again, ask your tax professional. But a tax credit is way more valuable dollars-wise than a tax deduction. That's just something good to keep in mind. So years ago, the credit was refundable. And what that meant is if you had more, when you got down to the bottom of your tax return, you owed the government, say instead of $20,000, you owed them $5,000. If you had a $10,000 tax credit, 5,000 minus 10,000 credit gives a $5,000 refund to you, the taxpayer. In previous years, you would then get a check like any other tax refund check for $5,000 from the IRS. Currently, the credit is non-refundable, which means you cannot have that refunded to you. What it does is it rolls over to next year's taxes. So in that same scenario, your $5,000, instead of being reduced to, a $5,000 credit, it's just reduced to zero. But then next year when you do your taxes, you still have that rollover $5,000 credit. So that's kind of the state that it is in right now. That's when you'll see on the presentation tonight things about refundable versus non-refundable. That's what we're talking about. It can offset to the extent the taxes you owe, but you cannot get a refund because maybe you had more adoption expenses than you owed in taxes. So there is currently something called the Adoption Tax Credit Refundability Act, and the bill numbers are there on your screen. That is before Congress. And if you would like to, if that's of interest to you, definitely contact whoever your state senator is, whoever your representative is, and let them know that you support it and you hope they do too, because that is something that can help families to truly get those adoption expenses help with them. Just briefly, some states also offer an adoption tax credit. I have absolutely no idea what states those are, because again, that's something that it's kind of like adoption law. Tax law on individual states, boy, that can change really frequently. So that is, again, something that I would ask your tax preparer. Does my state have an adoption credit? Or you know what, you may want to Google it yourself and find out, because sometimes, those are things that definitely can help. So that's what the adoption tax credit is. Currently, we're going to go into how much it is, but currently it's just over $13,000. And I think we all know that, domestic adoption costs more than $13,000, but we're going to talk about a couple other things that can help with that as well.
Mm-hmm. And I know, Heather, too, as you explained that, I think sometimes, I know for me, because I'm such a visual person, like a pen to paper kind of visual person, so I know that there are probably people listening right now like me who this may not click to make sense until you actually have the figures and the numbers and you're walking through claiming it. But for an average family, now, see, forgive me, I'm an artist, so I'm not even going to claim to be anywhere close to accounting expert. But for those who might identify with what I'm saying now, hopefully I will ask the dumb question and then they won't feel so awkward. But how does this look for, say, one of Lifetime's, average families? Because we all have a certain amount of taxes we owe every year come April. But at the same time, most of us are used to, you put in your charitable contributions, you write off your the expenses you paid towards a mortgage, you may have children to deduct already, and so a lot of times they may anticipate, every year we get around $2,500 back because we overpaid in taxes. So is that really what this is doing? It's basically telling the government you overpaid because you had this credit?
Yes and no. If you're looking at your IRS tax form, the items you mentioned, those are your deductions. Those are higher up on the form. We're talking about after you get your adjusted gross income, you get down what your taxable income is, and then you calculate the tax you owe. And then when you have the tax you owe, then you put in how much you paid. And usually that is, if you're employed, that is what was taken out of your check. If you're self-employed, that is what you paid in your quarterly estimates. So you have that, and then you have the tax you paid, and if at the end of the year the government, like you said, owes you a $2,500 refund, that's what you're used to. Where the tax credit comes in is it's just slightly above that, the tax you owe, and then you take the credits. That's where you get your credits. And then you subtract what you paid. So if you're used to getting a $2,500 refund because you usually overpaid, the tax credit isn't going to mean you don't get that $2,500 refund. What that means is, so say that, let's put some numbers here. Say the tax you owe is $10,000, okay? And then you take your credits, and say you take a $10,000 tax adoption credit. And then you put in, so now you're 10,000, so now you owe 0 taxes. But if you take what was withheld, I believe in most cases, whatever was withheld, that's your overpayment. Your overpayment can be refunded to you, or you can roll your overpayment into next year. You just cannot get refunded based solely on the tax credit.
Okay, and that's how I pictured it, but I love that you could walk it through like that, because just for most people I know that we help, because it is a common myth that we get a lot of people who want to adopt who say, I'm not rich. So they often think that people who afford adoption are somehow above the higher income levels on average, but that's not the truth at all. And so I think when someone hears, because usually they are working for an employer or they have been keeping track of their taxes as self-employed, that when you hear you owe $20,000 in tax, it almost sounds like that's the check you're cutting in April. But I love that you could back up and make it look like that. So I hope that helps some of you who maybe are a little bit like me, or maybe this was clear as mud before, kind of get an idea of how this can come back to help you later.
Right. I think it's good to understand it this way, Libby. Typically, if you paid something in, that part's refundable to you. But if the adoption tax credit takes it even further, then that part is not refundable. So if you overpaid your taxes, you get that back. If you didn't overpay, say you paid, there's people who adopt who pay no taxes, no income tax, because of different things. Maybe they have a large enough family that they don't have any federal income tax withheld, because at the end of the year they don't owe anything. They cannot get that credit refunded to them. So really, like I say, the best way to think of it is it's a credit to the taxes you owe. It's not a credit to the taxes you don't owe. So you don't get it back because you don't owe anything. That's not what it is. It's a credit to the taxes you owe. So let's keep moving on. I know there's some questions here, and a lot of the questions I think we're going to answer as we kind of keep moving forward.
Perfect.
So let's talk about what qualifies as adoption expenses.
And again, that question just came up.
I just want to remind you, what we're talking about today is not international, and it is not foster care. Our expert who was going to be here was able to speak to that. That's not anything I feel comfortable speaking towards. So I really want to just kind of keep us focused on domestic adoption, because that's it's a little more black and white, I think. So for domestic adoption expenses include costs directly related to your adoption that are reasonable and necessary. Now, they can be directly related, like your fees to your agency, your legal fees, court costs. They can even include things like FedEx of overnighting documents. They can include your travel to get your child. They can include printing profiles. They can even include your birth parent expenses. But now we're starting to get into, with the birth parents expenses, again, back up on that first bullet, reasonable and necessary. At Lifetime, birth parent expenses is something that we pay a lot of attention to. We really encourage birth mothers to what reasonable and allowable expenses are. And what that means is transportation, absolutely, that's a reasonable and an allowable and necessary part of, say, prenatal care. You got to get transportation, right? But buying someone a brand new SUV, sure, that's transportation too, but that's really not reasonable and allowable transportation when you're looking at adoption law. Again, I'm not talking about tax law, I'm talking about adoption law. So when it comes to your qualified adoption expenses, you know, you really have to look at what's reasonable and what's necessary. And the things I kind of laid out are, and the reality of it is the credit's only, just over $13,000. You're not going to get a brand new car in there. But I'm just sharing that that's kind of what the intent of the credit is what was necessary for this adoption. And the law specifies a number of other things. For instance, you cannot get the adoption tax credit when you maybe adopt a stepchild. That's not, yeah, that's not, I mean, that's wonderful, but again, it's one of those things that is not the intent of the law. So there are a few scenarios that don't necessarily qualify. Foster adoption, the law speaks to that too, because, if you think about a foster adoption, it's primarily paid by taxpayer dollars already. So the law is written so that people can't kind of double dip and get an adoption that's lower cost because it is, subsidized by the government, and then go and get a credit for having that adoption too. So, it's a great recommendation to keep track of all of your expenses. You're probably going to need it when you go to finalize your adoption. Often the court requires a statement of the expenses, because the court is going to look at things like the birth mother expenses and the fees paid, those types of things. So it's good to keep for your adoption legally. It's also good to keep for your IRS. And the best thing to do is just set up a system. Set up a system where you collect them, even if it's the old-fashioned box on a shelf up in the closet. Make a copy and put it up there. If you do it digitally, get a folder in, Google Drive or something like that, where everything is together for adoption, even if it's a duplicate of something you have someplace else. You want your adoption expenses to be easy to present to your tax preparer when it's time to come. I cannot tell you, here at Lifetime, from about February to April, we get a lot of calls. Hey, you know what? I can't find a copy of the invoice for our adoption services. Or, I can't find this. Did you keep track of how much we paid for birth mother expenses for, So definitely keep a copy, because you may be down to the wire with filing your taxes, and all of a sudden your CPA says, oh, hey, I got all the numbers, but I need the backup. I need the, the receipts and everything. You don't want to have to, file an extension because you don't have the documentation. While you're going through the process now, keep the documentation. It's really easy to do. Anything else on that you can think of, Libby? Or?
No, we're getting a lot of questions about when can we apply this credit, and do we have to wait until it's finalized, or just till we have placement, or is there any exception in between? So I think you're probably going to get there.
Yes, yes, we will get there. So let's keep going. Keep the questions coming. Like I say, we'll answer what we can, but we're going to try to get through the basics here first. So who qualifies? Again, domestic adoptions, they qualify. They do not qualify if you're adopting a stepchild. So if you adopted a child and you paid out-of-pocket expenses relating to the adoption, you should qualify for the tax credit. We're going to talk about limitations in just a minute, but the amount of the credit you qualify is directly related to how much you spent, what that means basically is, the credit is just over $13,000. If you only spent $6,000 adopting your brother's nephew, you're not going to get $13,000 in credit. It's limited to what was actually spent. So, and again, what was spent that qualifies as reasonable and necessary legal expenses. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, international and foster adoptions, there may be aspects of them that qualify, and that is something you need to speak with your tax professional about. But do the same thing with keeping track of the expenses. Keep them, because it's better to go in with more that you spent, and your tax preparer may say, well, you know what? New clothes to go pick up your baby. Yeah, no, we can't. That wasn't necessary. It's better to go in with more options and let him tell you or her what's reasonable and allowable than, to be scrambling at the last minute. So definitely keep everything you can, and then see what qualifies. Um,
Which I
so,
love that I know that we'll probably even talk about what kind of records to keep, what kind of
mhm,
documentation.
mhm,
So I hope that all of you are keeping notes, because also, what our intention for this webinar also was to spark questions that might apply to your specific adoption goals or experience, so that you could take that to a tax professional that you're working one-on-one with. Heather cannot file your taxes for you. Even tonight's guest speaker would not have been able to do every single one of your accounts. So it's so wise to take these notes and get answers checked off. Then also, if you have little exceptions and little questions that kind of fit in, like, well, what about this? And what about this little gray area or this little detail? Keep a list of those so that you can bring them when it comes time to take these steps and apply this to your specific family and your
right,
specific adoption story.
right.
So, please don't walk away from tonight's webinar thinking, I know everything I need to know and that I don't need any advice 2 years from now when I finalize my child's adoption or whenever that comes. You're going to need to always go back, especially for something that is as detailed and important as this. You want to make sure that you're making the most of it, but that also you're not putting anything at risk that your family's going to have to backtrack and explain later too. So, but I love that you're covering this all so that it's familiar. And again, we are speaking primarily from Lifetime's experience with domestic private adoptions. And some of this may apply if you had an international adoption, or if you have anything to claim with foster care and adopting through foster care. But just remember that those specific details are so important for you to talk to a tax professional who's familiar with your family, so that you're not feeling like you have to figure it all out on your own, and then you're just getting a headache or doing things wrong and having to correct them later. But take this as a good introduction to what to expect.
And I skipped ahead here accidentally. I know there's a few questions. I was going to pop back here,
Yeah.
because I know there's a few questions about, does this qualify? Does that qualify? Again, this is, can't get back there. What qualifies is it reasonable? Which most expenses are reasonable. Was it necessary? So if you paid, an adoption attorney, did you have to? Yes, you did. You had to pay an adoption attorney. Did you pay an agency or a facilitator or somebody to help you find and connect with the birth mother? Yes, then yes, that is necessary. What about a home study? Could you adopt without a home study? Nope. So yes, that is necessary. So, what's not necessary are probably going to be the things that you're not necessarily going to even think about. And like I say, because you're only talking about just over 13,000, most families are going to get to that 13,000 before they get to the end of their list of reasonable and necessary expenses. So let's move on to IRS documentation. What documentation do I need to keep for the IRS? And honestly, these are not things that you probably aren't keeping already. One is your final judgment of adoption. You're going to need your home study, your placement agreement completed by an authorized placement agency. What that means is your home study. You're going to have your post-placement visits with your home study. Just, keep documentation, and also ask your tax preparer specifically what in his experience has been needed. Again, that documentation of those expenses. I haven't heard of it recently, but about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a spike in audits of families who adopted. And it was just a short period of time, which I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe soon after that is when the credit became non-refundable. But that is just, it's one of those things that they were looking closely at. I have not heard of that in about the last 4 or 5 years, but you need to have those documentation of those qualified expenses. And then everything has to be signed and dated. The IRS, it won't take any of those documents if they're not signed and dated. And I mean, it makes sense because, without proper documentation, you can't show that you qualify. So it's just one of those things that your tax preparer will tell you what he needs and what the IRS is looking for specifically, and then that's just what you need to prepare. But like I say, in the meantime, now keep those expenses, because you are paying expenses.
And if you're not sure, I mean, I would say if there are things that you're not sure, save everything, so
yes.
that later they can say yes, no, yes, 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 no, no, no,
right.
But that you don't miss out either.
Right. So here are the current and the last few years adoption tax credit amounts. They consider these adjusted for inflation. They don't seem to be too adjusted for my grocery store. I mean, inflation's going up really high there, but so these are going up a little bit. You can see for this tax year, it's $13,570, and it is non-refundable. So those are the amounts of the adoption tax credit. And like I say, most families who are pursuing a domestic private adoption, you're going to get to the $13,000, often with just one professional. It just is how it is. So
now, what's your understanding with rolling them over? Because I have heard that before, and I've had a few questions pop up here tonight. So that if you max that credit, can you also then the next year take another round of
well, I'm gonna. This is the adoption tax credit amount per adoption.
Yes. Okay.
If for my adoption, I only owe $8,000 in taxes this year, I can use $8,000 of my $13,000, and then I have $5,000 to roll against next year's taxes. But if my expenses exceed $13,000, I can't roll my expenses and take another $13,000 next year, because it's only for one adoption. One adoption. So that's what that is. So yeah, if you can't use all of your $13,000 this year, but you spent it, you can roll it to next year. Okay. So let's go.
Again, excellent things to write down so that when it does come that time, because here we are, coming into the holiday season, and I know people start to get taxes on their mind a little, but this will really come into play, especially for those of you who welcomed babies this year and maybe finalized already, that you're already looking at what's coming ahead. And as a reminder too, Heather, can you also explain that when you are claiming your adoption tax credit, that is after you've already added the fact that you added a new child dependent to your home as a deduction. So
right. So
that's an additional thing.
You are. Yes, you are getting that extra child deduction in that year too. So they both help. Good to keep in mind. This, what I'm showing now on the screen, is the phase out ranges. Once your income hits a certain point, your tax credit starts going down. So for this tax year, it starts being reduced at that $203,000 number, and then is fully phased out around that $243,000 number. And really what that's saying is, I mean, if I were to interpret what the IRS is saving, is if you're making $243,000 of taxable income a year, you probably don't need the $13,000 tax credit for adoption. So that's why they do phase it out at that level. I certainly know this affects some families. I would say it probably does not affect the bulk of families pursuing adoption today.
Right.
So I don't think we have a lot of questions on that. Here's just some general information about the tax credit. All grants are subtracted from your expenses. So say you add up all your total expenses and they're $15,000 because you were able to do different things, and but you got a $10,000 grant. Well, that takes your out-of-pocket expenses down to $5,000. So the only tax credit you'll be able to claim is up to $5,000 of reasonable and necessary adoption expenses. If your adoption, was $30,000 and you got the $10,000 grant, you have $20,000 in reasonable and necessary expenses. You can still claim up to that $13,000 number. So, but you do have to subtract grants. I think I've mentioned a couple times, the credit is not available to adopt your stepchild.
Right.
And then I like this statement because it was really succinct. A tax credit is a dollar for dollar reduction in your overall tax liability. That's why the credit is so much more valuable than the deduction. A tax deduction lowers your income, which in turn lowers your taxes according to your tax bracket. So a deduction, it's great, but it saves you pennies on the dollar, or maybe dimes on the dollar. But a credit is a dollar for dollar reduction. So a credit is just a lot more valuable, financially speaking. And then some of you may have adoption assistance as an employee benefit. I know a lot of the larger nationwide companies, even like fast food places. Wendy's has one of the largest, and it's just, you can be the guy that flips burgers and you can qualify for a very substantial adoption benefit. Usually those can be excluded from your income in terms of you don't have to pay taxes on the money your employer gives you for adoption. But that is something you need to talk to your tax preparer for. That is also something that gets a little dicey on how that comes into play with your expenses too. And that is something I would always refer to your tax preparer for.
And I just want to encourage people. I mean, if you're, maybe you're like me, maybe someone in your family has always been comfortable helping you do your taxes every year, but in a special scenario like the adoption tax credit, I would probably be more inclined to go to a tax preparer and have that rather than to try and make sense of it on my own using, say, an online program or my mother-in-law or someone who's just good at doing taxes. When you have special circumstances, it is wise to get the advice of people who do this all the time, because there are unique questions that may come up. There are unique little details and figures that you want to make sure you're getting prepared accurately.
And not just that,
don't
Libby.
Be surprised if that has to come into play.
Yeah, but tax law changes. And, sometimes tax law changes, after the new year has started, and it's tax law, yes, for this year, but it may have effect on previous year. So definitely, the adoption tax credit is one of those things that if you normally do your own taxes, you can read up on and see how comfortable you feel about it, but you may still want to get just a brief consultation even with a CPA.
Yes.
If you feel, okay, I feel pretty confident on this, I just want to ask a couple questions, definitely reach out to them and do that. You don't have to go and pay to have someone prepare your taxes just because you're not 100% sure, but you can go and talk to someone about that one item as well. I do know I have talked to some families who do their taxes on TurboTax or Tax Act or different things like that, and they have found that the programs walk them through that well enough that they feel confident submitting it to the IRS.
Excellent.
So, yeah. I just see a couple questions I'm going to ask answer briefly, and
Great.
that is we finalized our adoption in 2017, but paid our lifetime fee in 2016. Can we still claim it? Yes. You can claim one credit for one adoption, and whenever you paid those fees, they're still part of that one adoption that's taken in the year it's finalized. So what you can't do is you can't take the adoption credit twice for one adoption. It's for each adoption, not each year. Does that make sense, Libby?
I think so. I wrote down the question, do the expenses you claim for the credit all have to have happened within the same year you finalized? And my assumption to that answer would be no. Because one great example is, for instance, if your baby is born right now, chances are pretty good in most states you're not going to finalize this adoption until next year. So your adoption expenses may have, majority of them happened, say, in 2017, but you're going to be claiming this more than a year from now.
Right.
So that, I'm glad you could answer that, because I think that's an important question. Can we just verify right now when you get to claim these expenses?
My understanding is you claim them in the year your adoption is finalized.
Okay. And that's been my understanding as well. Now, what if there was a failed adoption? Do you know anything about that experience?
I do, and this is what I know. I have heard conflicting accounts on both sides. I do know for a fact, if you had a failed adoption and then you did complete an adoption, maybe with a different birth mother, those expenses can all be for the same. They can all be claimed for the one adoption, whether it was failed or not. It's all still was part of the resulting in your adoption. In regards to claiming for a failed adoption that maybe you have not yet adopted, or maybe a number of families, once they have a failed adoption, they may determine that that's not an emotional risk they want to do again and want to stop the process. That is something you need to talk to your tax preparer about. I have heard and seen it both ways, and it's not an issue I would feel comfortable counseling one way or another on.
I would also add too, like you mentioned before, that some states, because adoption law and adoption tax law can vary state to state too. Now, what we're talking about is the federal adoption tax credit.
Yes. Yeah.
So I have worked with families that live in states where they could claim failed adoption expenses because of their state law for their state taxes. So again, that's something to get confirmation about. You may not need to hire, like you said, you may not need to hire someone to prepare all of your taxes, but maybe a consultation to just get some clarity about where to go. Also, remember, if you went through a failed adoption, chances are you had an attorney involved. So for me, I would probably even start by asking that attorney, is there anything we can do to try and redeem some of what we lost in this failed adoption?
Right. Absolutely.
Excellent.
So let's kind of keep going here. Let's see what else we have to talk about.
Can you confirm? I saw something you talked about, but could you go back over again? There was a question about employer benefits. Where did that go? What about, so let's just say a scenario, an example would be, because I see a couple different questions here. What if you get, say, a grant from a local charity, gives you, a charity in your area gives you a grant towards your adoption, and then your husband's employer also has adoption employer benefits. So maybe they get, between the grant and the employer, they got $5,000 towards their adoption. Can they even claim those as their own expenses paid when they're doing this, when they're doing their taxes?
You have to deduct grants from your expenses. That's just, that is my complete understanding of adoption grants.
Do not include a grant in the expenses you paid out of your own pocket.
Well, no, you have to subtract it. So
I mean, someone
again,
gave it to you. So.
I paid $10,000, but there's a nonprofit organization that gave me a grant of $3,000. So taking that, I actually only paid 7. So it's not right that I try to take a tax credit of 10, because then basically
Right.
I'm saving another 3,000. I mean, it's
Plus, they're
nice,
already
but
probably claiming the tax deduction too because they
right,
gave it to someone.
right.
Yes, that makes
So
a lot of sense.
so
So
that
what
gets
about
into
the
the
employer
whole
benefit?
that's the whole double dipping thing. Employer
Mhm.
benefits are kind of a different animal, and that's why I brought this up here. It says it may be excluded from your taxable income. This is an area, again, that I would encourage you need to talk to a tax professional about what their recommendation is. Some employers, you may have it pop up on your check as income. And it can be what? Maybe I make $40,000 a year, but my W-2 shows I made 43,000 because it may be considered taxable income. Another way to think about this, Libby, is there's certain benefits that employers give that they have to show on your W-2 as taxable income. One of those is if they have I can't think of the word, but a really, really super, super great health insurance plan that you don't pay for. Or if they have a very, very high life insurance policy that your spouse is the beneficiary of. Um, there's certain things that employers may give you. A company car that you're allowed to use for personal use. Those things the IRS requires to be shown as taxable income. Adoption assistance may be one of those. It can be excluded from your income, but then you're kind of getting into that area of, well, if I pay taxes on it, well, then I shouldn't have to deduct it from my expenses. This is an area I don't want to tell anyone what to do on because there's so many variations in how employers handle it on your W-2, if it's taxable or non-taxable, on how it is shown or how it is given to you. Some employers pay it directly to the adoption professional. I know here at Lifetime, it's not uncommon for us to have a call from someone to say, my employer has $6,000 of adoption assistance. They will be paying it directly to you. Well, that's great because what that means is it's great for the employee who's doing their taxes because it means they never received the money. So it may or may not be taxable income. I'm not going to speak to that because that's employment law, taxes. That's not adoption. But the employee never received it, so they may or may not have paid taxes on it. But also the employee never paid it out. So when they get their invoice showing what the employee paid, it is reduced by that $6,000. So it's nice and clean. Okay, we paid Lifetime X number of dollars, and that 6,000 is completely removed from what they paid. Employers do that frequently. They will pay someone directly, and then the employee, can you claim that 6,000? No, it's not an adoption expense because you never paid it. And quite honestly, the employee shouldn't have record of having paid it because they never did. So if your employer offers adoption assistance, that's a cleaner way to do it, is seeing if they can just pay the professional directly, which many of them do, and they do as a policy. But in terms of if the employee claims it as income or if the employee has to deduct it from the adoption expenses, that, like I say, because that is all tied up with payroll taxes and all that, that's where you need to do a lot of good reading and be confident, or what I would do is talk to a professional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there really are, I'm seeing a lot of comments from people, well, what about my situation? What about this instance? And one webinar in itself would be probably near impossible to give you all specific directions. So mostly, what we want to do is, for me, I feel like even just talking about it in this way and not just keeping it as a brief answer, but really focusing this whole entire webinar on this topic, is it makes it easier to know the questions you need to ask.
Right.
So
and I just
if
want to
the
share
what ifs come to mind, just note them down.
I just want to share a few of these comments because they're comments from you attendees, and certainly not advice, because I am giving no tax advice today. I'm just sharing what I know
Right.
about this. But someone said, and this is great. I don't know if it helps, but we had a failed adoption this summer, and the lawyer said since there was a baby born, we could claim it toward the tax credit. That's great, but that's the power of talking to someone who has the experience in that area. Um, and that's great. Thanks so much for sharing that. Someone else commented, if you spent $1,000 on your adoption past the credit, can you make deductions for expenses? Not that I'm aware, but hey, I would take anything like that to my CPA, and that's one of the things. Um, Someone else, I'm not even going to read that because I'm not 100% sure that's legal, so I'm not going to say that. Um, but most families are well over the $13,000 number, um, and they have those allowable expenses. And even if they've received a grant, usually they're still over the $13,000 number, unless it was a type of grant I don't know about. I know someone asked, how do you receive a grant for large amounts of money? Um, I, I I don't know. I know there's certain organizations that um, I have seen them rarely, and also I believe there's often a connection that, if you don't know them, you may not get. So it's one of those things. I think it's, and I've said this before, Libby, when we talk about affording adoption, if I were adopting today and needed to raise money for it, I would find a way to get a second job or to um, sell my talents in a way that I would earn money for that. Now that you all know I have a little bit of, accounting background, that's something I do. I'd find a couple of side bookkeeping jobs I could do from home. That is a way to make and save more money for adoption than to go chase grants, because it's just, it takes so much effort, and then it takes time to wait. Many grants only award twice a year. Some only award once a year. And you're waiting that long and you may walk away with $500. And was it all worth it? When you could have worked an extra 8 hours a week and made a lot more. I know we helped a family adopt years ago who, she was a nurse, and she worked 3 12-hour shifts, and they wanted to build up actually their birth mother budget. So she started taking 2 per diem shifts a month. And in no time it was like boop, 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 up was their budget. They ended up not needing it for that, but they had to wait longer for ICPC clearance. So how they shared it with us was, we stayed in a nicer place because we could afford it for an extra week. So there's just different ways to do that. And I guess there's a free financial tip while we're talking about taxes. But for my money, that's definitely what I would do. Before we start seeing what questions here we have, I just wanted to show some other links here. So these are just some basic links, and I'm going to tell you, the only one I would write down if you're writing anything down is adoptiontaxcredit.org. I wouldn't necessarily write down the other two, except write down IRS Topic 607 and IRS Form 8839. You can Google them, and Google takes you literally right to what you need. But I just pulled those up here so we can look at them real quick. Here is Save the Adoption Tax Credit. This is just a page that kind of has current up-to-date information on the adoption tax credit. They have Facebook, 30,000 Facebook fans. Definitely follow them on Facebook. It also gets you information on how to follow up with the legislators who are writing the bill to make it refundable, different things you can do. It's just a great place to get kind of the latest news on that. One of the other resources I gave you was IRS Topic 607. If you want to do some I was going to jokingly call it light reading, but I don't even know that it's even a funny joke. This gets into the nitty-gritty. It's not long at all. You can print it out and dissect it. It actually is pretty understandable. You will have questions probably on how different things apply to you, but there are examples here. They are there. It talks about what qualified adoptions are. I know somebody I just saw about traveling expenses. Traveling expenses are a qualified adoption expense, including meals and lodging. So reading this page, IRS topic 607 will give you a good amount of information. And then the last one is the actual form, and it's the IRS form 8839. And this is the form that you fill out when you have to take the credit. One of the cool things on here that we didn't answer, but it's really good. If you adopt more than one child, guess what? Each adoption qualifies for the credit. But as a lot of you probably know, you don't have to pay. I mean, I know here at Lifetime, we helped 2 families this year who adopted a sibling group of 3 children. They only pay us to help them once, but they get the tax credit for each child. So a family who adopts a sibling group of 3 is going to get a $37,000 tax credit, and they actually probably may or may not have paid that, depending on what was there. But same thing with twins. If you adopt twins, you will get $26,000 tax credit. So you get a little more room under that. Certainly adopting multiples or a sibling group is a lot more work, and it is more. It's just not double the adoption expense. You are going to have to pay an attorney more because he has to finalize 2 adoptions, not 1.
Right.
But obviously,
usually parents' fees,
right?
Yeah, all of
that. But you don't usually travel 3 times for 3 kids. It's it's 1 time. So
it's not 2 or 3 different birth mothers that you're moving towards domestic adoption. You're just having different that I would say, and that's a totally different webinar. But that is a common. That's a common question. Is okay. Right. So I hired an agency, for example, to help me find one birth mother opportunity, but she had twins, and then sometimes those families are surprised. Oh my goodness, we didn't realize that we'd have to pay finalization costs and clearance to get clearance for each child separately, which is money to the state for that and different legal things. So they don't always understand that until it happens. So that is good to bring it up, but it also is very interesting in how it comes back when you're claiming this credit too, that they do take that into consideration.
Absolutely. And one thing I just want to show on here, I don't know how well anyone can see this, but on this form that you fill out, it actually asks you, where was that? I just saw it. Oh, right here, number 13. Credit carry forward, if any, from prior years. So that is if you had more credit, like we talked about, than you can take because you simply didn't, your tax liability wasn't that high, it carries forward. So your tax liability was $5,000, your adoption credit was $13,000. You could only use 5. You carry $8,000 over to the next year. So it does definitely carry forward. So one of the things I really want to share is this information is available to every single one of you. Topic 607 on the IRS page. I promise you, you don't have to be a CPA to understand the basics of this. I know there's been a lot of questions about timing. It talks about the timing rules. A lot of questions about that we haven't answered about special needs and things like that, because most families who are looking to this are not, if they're doing special needs, often they're going through through the foster system, or their agency advises them that, there may be additional assistance available. But, I would print this page out, topic number 607. I would print out form 8839. These are things that like I say, they're pretty, I'm not going to say, I mean, tax law is never easy to understand, but they really tried to make this understandable for the layperson. I mean, they talk about what's qualified adoption expenses, and it's many of the things that we've been talking about tonight: court costs, attorney's fees, reasonable and necessary adoption fees. Those are things like your agency fees, like your profile costs, travel. And then it says other expenses directly related to and for the principal purpose of the legal adoption. And a great question to ask yourself here is, was that necessary for my adoption? Was a home study necessary for my adoption? Yes. Was travel to pick up my child necessary for my adoption? Yes. Were profiles necessary? Yes. Was a new outfit to meet my baby necessary? Well, probably not. Was a special outfit for my baby at the hospital necessary? Well, probably not. Again, if you were having a biological baby, the special outfit, you bring the baby home in, that's not deductible anywhere. It's just clothes.
Right.
So
well, and I kept thinking, like, if you're real extravagant and you're traveling, I mean, again, like going back where you started tonight, reasonable and necessary.
Yeah. Yeah.
So don't look at it as this is our chance to, eat lobster every night and we get to write it all off. I mean,
yeah. Yeah. Well, but if you eat lobster while you're traveling to go get your baby, guess what?
I suppose. I guess.
Yeah. Somebody summarized this, and I think this was great, Sarah. Thank you for this. The way I understand it is if you owe $0 to the IRS, you don't get a refund check of $13,000. It just keeps rolling over to the next year's credit. Absolutely. And that is not, just to be clear, that is not if at the end of the year you owed the IRS $10,000 and had $10,000 withheld from your check, so technically you owe the IRS nothing. No, that's not what it means. It means if you get to how much taxes do you owe the IRS, 0, then you do not take the tax credit. It's not about the withholding part. The withholding part is separate. It has to do with taxes owed. So if you owed 0 because you had your $10,000 withheld, then your $10,000 is an overpayment and it will be coming back to you. But the credit is not refundable if the taxes owed is 0 before you figure out what you paid to the IRS. I hope that makes it clear.
It can get confusing, and that again is, it's why we don't want to stand here and try and give all of you specific tax advice. That would be unfair.
Yeah.
Because even with adoptions, you could do 2 adoptions in the same state and probably even the same city, and sometimes there's just different things that apply because of those circumstances or the situation. It's not to say that it just changes on a whim. It's just adoption is such a personal thing, and there are so many aspects and details to take into consideration, which is why, putting aside the need for a qualified tax expert to answer some of these very unique questions, but which is why it is so important that you are trusting qualified adoption professionals, because if you work with an attorney who's only familiar with, say, divorce law, they may not be keeping track of things in a way that you will need when it is time to claim this tax credit.
Or they may just be unfamiliar enough with adoption that it ends up costing you twice as much as it would have with a qualified adoption attorney.
Yes. So, and that's why I saw a couple questions earlier, can I call someone at Lifetime and just hash this through? And really our answer, even if you called our office and you were already working with us on a match, is that we would maybe share a little bit of experience from what has worked for other families, but we would always point you back to the expert familiar in that field related to your question.
Right.
So.
And here's why. we can, we could all sit around and read topic 607 together, but it is so unique to every family. It is so, I mean, for instance, if you have one spouse that works and one spouse that's self-employed, well, you've got self-employment tax for the self-employed spouse too. So where does that fit into this? And I'm not even going to touch that one. There's a lot of different scenarios with different types of income, with different taxes, different things like that. It
Right.
really, you know, the people who can do this themselves are probably a couple that they both work, and it's really pretty straightforward. You don't have a lot of investments. You don't have a lot of, it's your taxes are pretty boring. When you start to get the complicated parts, that's where it really you need somebody to help you. And hey, if you, it may be boring, but you still need somebody to help you because you don't feel confident. So I think it's always great to talk to, even if you go into H&R Block, you don't have to go and pay a CPA to sit down and, review everything with you, because that may be way more than you need. There are tax preparers out there. You can go and work through TurboTax or TaxAct, see how you feel about that. There's so much great information out there, but a lot of it can't replace a professional when it's something like this. And you may look back at those limits we were looking at. If your income at, when you get down to it is over that limit, this isn't going to matter too terribly much anyway. Or you really need a tax preparer to see what else they can help you with maximizing your deductions to get your income below that limit so you can take advantage of the credit. So, there's just a lot there. And no, you can't call and ask me because I am going to refer you to a professional, because there's just too much
Right.
in each individual's story.
This is not to negate our webinar tonight, but
Not at all.
this is such an important topic, and really in just an hour, to just kind of give you this umbrella overview. Because again, our hope and our goal with this was, this is a common question. Adoptive parents have at any stage of their adoption planning. And so it's really good to have these conversations and to talk, because it will also help things to make sense when you do hear news that maybe it's changed a little, or now something else applies, and you'll think, oh, that wasn't like that before, and it will suddenly make more sense, rather than having to dive in right then and dig it all up and get to an understanding. You will actually know, okay, so you're kind of rolling along and adding knowledge to this, but also
Right.
each one of you is going to have a very unique story. So don't hesitate. Like she said, I loved your advice moments ago, Heather, where you just said you may not need to have a tax professional completely take over for you, but maybe you just need a consultation to get some clarity about how different things apply. We did have a question here. Did you touch on this at all about, is there ever a time when the credit expires? Like, is it too late to apply it?
Well, it's not expired now. And they're actually trying to make it refundable. So contact your your senators about that. But in terms of, I guess I don't know if that means in the future. Is it possible it's refundable? There's a
I
huge.
read it as, what if I forgot to apply it the year I finalized my adoption and I want to take it next year? I mean, is there ever kind of a,
I see what you're saying.
it's too late
That
to
is
claim it kind of thing?
well, that's a question. Well, that's a question for your that I would take to a professional, because it may be, if you have to take it in the year your adoption was finalized, your accountant can amend your tax return, so you can still take it. You have to, refile that year's taxes. Now, if it's 10 years ago, I don't know what that means. I don't know if you can refile 10 years ago. But if if your adoption
Yeah.
finalized on, 12/28, and you totally forgot about it until May after your taxes were filed, yeah, you can refile your taxes. That's not a big deal. Can you take it in the year after your adoption finalized? I don't know. That is a question for your tax preparer.
I did see a couple questions or comments come in related to this. One of them said, I'm sorry, what I meant was if we apply for the credit now and then we have carryover, how many years can we carry it over? And then I had a couple other people chime in that said their understanding was 5 years. But again, I would confirm that. Look at the information that Heather pulled up about this particular tax credit.
Topic 607, IRS topic 607.
Okay. And that should help answer that for you. This has been great, and we've been having a lot of questions about if this will be available later, and the answer is yes, although it may be limited, so you may have to kind of keep an eye on your email or on our Facebook to see when it is available. But definitely, if you need clarity or you missed part of this or you just looked away for a moment and missed a slide or something, please revisit this later. But also just remember too that if we can help with your personal adoption, we didn't talk about the steps to just learning more about Lifetime, but whether you're already working with Lifetime or you're just starting to explore a path through adoption, questions and education are so important to us at Lifetime. So if the person that answers the phone doesn't have the answer, we'll get you to the person who does. It's so important to make sure you have clarity about every aspect involved in a safe and healthy adoption, just so that you can have the peace of mind when you are finalizing that you don't wish you had thought of something before, or that you threw away a document that's so vitally important now, that you get the answers as you move through the process so that you are as prepared as possible for each step ahead of you. So if we can ever help with more information, please feel free to reach out. Our main website is lifetimeadoption.com. If you would like to talk with someone at Lifetime, the best phone number for anyone, just the general phone number, is 1-800-923-6784. Monday through Friday, we have staff in both of our offices all day long who are happy to help in any way they can. But Heather, thanks for joining us on the fly tonight and giving us such a thorough presentation of this material. So again,
I do want to say, Libby, in the chat box, I'm putting those links in real quick. So if you want them, grab them on the IRS forms and the tax topics.
I see that. Perfect. And again, if you want to do some homework, maybe you're all fired up now and you're thinking, I need to go research that right now. Those topics that are easy to Google are IRS topic 607 and what was that other one? The tax form 8839.
Yep. And then savetheadoptiontaxcredit.org.
Yes, adoptiontaxcredit.org. Perfect.
Adoption, yes.
So thank you, Heather, for being here tonight. Thank you to everyone who took time to learn more about this topic. And we will hope to meet with all of you again soon. Have a great evening, everyone, and keep in touch. Thanks again.